Hey guys, Zomfox here. And now that the USL has fully finished 2 seasons of play, and it's been a few months since the second season ended, I feel like we can now fully ask this question and have an answer for it. Who's the GOAT? Who is the greatest of all time in the new USFL? Yes, it's only been 2 seasons, but 2 seasons is a lot more of an indicator of how great you are than 1 season. Because if we did this after the first season, it'd just be Turpin because, hey, MVP, i.e., the GOAT. But now that we've had 2 seasons, we can actually ask the question and have an answer, pretty much. Or at least I'll give my answer of who the GOAT is currently. Now, yes, this is going to change year after year. Whether the USFL plays by itself as the USFL next season, we could see a new guy emerge as being the GOAT. And if the league merges with the XFL, either this will be, whoever the GOAT is today is the GOAT of the new USFL, or it'll be the stats carryover, yada yada. There's a lot of things. But before I talk about who I think the two main guys are that have a GOAT case, I'm going to look at some honorable mentions to tell you why I don't think they are the GOAT, but why they definitely are up there. So let's get started. So the first honorable mention is going to be Alex Magoo. Now, Magoo, at face value, I think a lot of people might say is the USFL GOAT because he did have that incredible 2023 season. He won MVP, had an unbelievable playoff run, and he, has been back-to-back champs. And of course, he did play in the second half of that 2022 championship game and ended up, helping lead the Stallions to win that game. The only issues with that one especially is he beat KJ Costello. He didn't outduel, Case Cookus, which would have been a much bigger deal. And of course, fact is in 2022, he only played really two halves for the most part. He played a first half and a second half. Coincidentally, from the beginning and end of the season in week one and the championship. So while I do think that he definitely has a great case, I think the fact that his 2022 season is pretty much just one game, where at least for the season, Jamar was the better quarterback. And we'll see this upcoming season with Jamar probably being the starter now with the Stallions, pending Alex Magoo coming back. We'll see just how, big a difference Magoo is to Jamar. I think that Magoo has a great argument, but I don't have him as the GOAT. Then CJ Maribel is a very sneaky good case for the GOAT, honestly. He's been pretty much the bell cow back for most of the Stallions' history before Bo Scarborough came in 2022 and the entire 2023 season, where this past season he was one of the best running backs, and in the playoffs he took it to another gear. The only issue is that he's never been the number one option on the team. There's always been guys like Victor Bolin Jr., Marlon Williams, Bo Scarborough, or Alex Magoo, or Jay Sternberger, who have always felt like a better offensive player than Maribel. And the issue is that the running back position is just so loaded in the USFL, and that he's never been considered really the top tier. He's been like around that, like, if you do a tier list, you'd put him in A tier, but you wouldn't put him in S tier. Great argument, very sneaky good case for the GOAT, arguably a top 5 player all time in the new USFL, but I don't have him as the GOAT. Then this triple threat are guys who are very similar. You got Jerron Jones, Brandon Aubrey, and Toby Johnson. Jones and Johnson, both are the only two-time All-USFL players. The issue with Jerron Jones is that while he has been two-time All-USFL, he is a tackle, and the fact is that his teams have never really been great. And then Toby Johnson, he's been a very solid defensive tackle, one of the best in the league. But the only issue is you've never looked at him as the highest echelon of defensive player. He's never been in any sort of DPOY conversation at all. And it's hard-pressed to view him as a top 5 defender in either season. And Brandon Aubrey, while he has been incredible in the NFL and honestly was absurdly good in the USFL, he is a kicker. And the fact is that you can't really think of that type of iconic moment the way you can with Luis Aguilar having that 8-for-8 game, or, even like Matt Coughlin's 5-for-5 and all that kind of thing. Aubrey's incredible, and he's been a very consistent kicker, but he is a kicker. It's hard-pressed to actually put him as the GOAT. And then really the last main honorable mention I want to say is going to be none other than Frank Gidna. Gidna is very, very, very arguable. I would say he's probably third all-time currently. He was DPOY this past season in a year where it was a very close race. 2022, Chris Odom was just so far and away the best, in my opinion, player in the league, and especially defender. It was no contest that he won the award. But this year you had Tizina, who was incredible. Orr was great. Diggs was very solid. And you had Breland Speaks was still very good. Mark Gilbert was very solid. But Gidna ended up winning it, and he was pretty much the favorite the entire year. And he was honestly very sneaky good in 2022, which I've talked about in the past. He was really one of the best linebackers that year, but no one really gave him credit for it. It's just the two guys that I have as the arguable GOATs are just, they're that step above Gidna. They're that slight edge to him in terms of just how incredible their best year was and how great their not best year was. I think Gidna has a great case for third, but I'm not going to put him in the actual GOAT conversation. So, who is my argument for the GOAT? I think it's pretty clear. It's Darius Victor versus Mark Thompson. This is the debate on who is the new USFL GOAT across 2 seasons. Both guys might be running backs, but the fact is they've been just so incredible for really both seasons. And what they've accomplished just puts them in that highest of high echelon to where I feel like if you're going to talk about the two best players in the new USFL's history, it's one of these two guys. So, first and foremost is the career stat totals of them in the new USFL. Darius Victor holds the rushing title at 1,131 total yards, which Thompson is very close to him at 1,116. With the one caveat, though, being, well, two mainly, is that number one, Mark Thompson does have 3 more carries per game than Victor gets. And the other one is that Thompson did miss 3 games to Victor's 20. But the biggest difference is in the receiving game, honestly. Darius Victor has had 2 solid receiving seasons versus Thompson, who hasn't really done much receiving. I mean, less than 150 yards across 2 seasons versus Darius Victor having over 300. And the fact is that Victor has 4 receiving touchdowns compared to Mark Thompson's 2. But the fumbles is also an edge for Thompson. Thompson has 5 less fumbles and 5 less fumbles lost. In fact, he still hasn't lost a fumble. And overall, while Victor does beat Thompson in scrimmage yards by almost 200, the yards per game, rushing and scrimmage yards per game, both go to Thompson. Despite the fact that he did pretty much nothing on the receiving game compared to like Darius Victor and other guys, the fact that he's done what he's done in less games is insane. Only 17 games, and he's put up stats that are very comparable to Victor is a big deal. Now, while Darius does have less carries per game, he got a lot more, of help from the receiving game. So, stat-wise, I would say the slight edge does go to Mark Thompson because while Victor does beat him in some of the, quantity, total stats, especially the one stat of yards per rush is a very good thing for Victor. The fact is that Thompson played in 3 less games and is very near Darius Victor in a lot of stats. And that leads to the next point, and that's their overall awards and rankings. Both men are Offensive Player of the Years. Victor won it in 2022, Thompson won it in 2023. Both of them were all USFL running backs that year, and both of them were among the elite running backs in the year that they did. In 2022, Darius Victor was 3rd in rushing yards, 5th in yards per game, in rush yards per game, 1st in rush TDs, versus Thompson, who was 5th in rush yards, but what did have the 2nd most carries with no fumbles. And that leads to 2023, where Darius Victor was 3rd in rushing yards, 3rd in yards per rush, 3rd in rush yards per game, and he was tied 4th in rush TDs. But that being said, Mark Thompson was 2nd in rushing yards. He was 5th in yards per rush, but he was 1st in yards per game and 1st in TDs. In fact, that season is one of the elite seasons in really the entire USFL history. Even if you look at the old, 18-game high-end talent USFL, Thompson's 13 touchdowns he had this year, yes, 13 in just 8 games is unbelievable. It is arguably the best season any offensive player that's not Alex Magoo and Cavante Turpin has had. In fact, you could argue it was better than Cavante offensively. Thompson's 2023 was just insane. So in overall accolades, it's very obvious that 2023 easily goes to Mark, but 2022 easily goes to Victor. Both of them are very close, but I'd say that overall Victor gets the slight edge because in his lesser season, it was more impressive than Thompson's lesser season. As in terms of the, stats that aren't fumbles, Thompson really only competed in the elite in rush yards, whereas Victor in 2023 competed in basically every stat. But that leads to pretty much the last arguable point, the team. The Generals went 9-1 in 2022 with an 0-1 record in the playoffs, but then followed that up with a 3-7 season in 2023 to finish with a record of 12-8 and an 0-1 postseason record. This is compared to the Gamblers, who went 3-7 in 2022, followed by a 5-5 campaign in 2023, which leads to a grand total of 8-12. Now, the one caveat is that Mark Thompson did miss 3 total games across both years, and without Mark Thompson, the team's record is 0-3 versus 8-9 with him. And of course, this past season is the big deal, as I talked about before. The Gamblers lost their first 2 games of the 2023 season, which happened to be the 2 games that Mark Thompson didn't play this year. If Mark Thompson plays in those games, the Gamblers realistically probably make the playoffs. But the biggest caveat is the overall high end talent of the team. The Gamblers are just a lot less in that talent area. The Gamblers have one offensive line All USFL player in 2023, and in total across both years, on the whole roster, they have seven. That's compared to the Generals, who in 2022 alone had seven. And yes, this is counting Mark Thompson and Darius Victor into that total. So in just 1 year, the Generals had as many All USFL players as the Gamblers did in both years. And even in 2023, the Generals not being that good, finishing 3-7, they still had five All USFL players. And the most important fact is that in both seasons, two of the five offensive linemen in the Generals were All USFL. They were two of the elite offensive linemen in the season both years. And that's despite them being two different offensive linemen each year versus the Gamblers who had one. Now, that's the biggest difference. Darius Victor had a much better offensive line to run with versus what Thompson had. Now, yes, the Generals have the big caveat of Trey Williams took a lot of Darius Victor's carries, especially in 2022, versus what Thompson had, which is really he had like TJ Pledger as his best running back this past season, who basically didn't do that much. So you always have that question of, is the other guy hurting or helping? I would say overall, though, even with Trey Williams taking a lot of Victor's carries, the fact is that Darius Victor had a much better team around him, just by far. You're talking about the first year in 2022, where he won all the awards and all that, where you had Kevontae Turpin being this unbelievable play action threat, DeAndre Johnson and Trey Williams at their best running the ball, making this insane option to where when you're running like option plays, if Victor gets the ball, he's getting a ton of yards with that. And that's pretty much what you look at it. And even in this past season where he didn't really have Williams as much as he did in 2022, Darius Victor was still a very great running back. But a lot of that is because of the offensive line. Two separate All USFL players helps a lot. And to where, overall, when you look at it, I think that when you consider the fact that the team's record of the Gamblers with and without Mark Thompson, you look at the fact that Thompson had this unbelievable, historic year this past season, and he did it with a worse offensive line. I feel like if you're looking at it right now, the new USFL GOAT is currently Mark Thompson. Yes, Darius Victor has been incredible, but to me, it's that idea of when you're just looking at the two guys, when you actually take a hard look at it, both of them had one incredible season. And now, while when you consider both seasons, I think Victor did technically have better accolades and all that, Mark Thompson's best season was better than Victor's best season. It just was. 4 more touchdowns in 2 less games is unbelievable. And when you consider the fact that if Thompson had played those 2 other games, he would have easily won the rushing crown this year. And I mean, it's not no debate. I think that Mark Thompson is currently the USFL GOAT. We'll see what happens next season. Does he come back? Does he come back for the Gamblers? What ends up happening, we'll see. But that'll do it. This has been Zom Fox. If you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. And as always, have a great night.